Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. I think that we may be surprised by how things develop over the next couple months. My sense is that the logjam in Congress is beginning to break. That doesn't shock me. You know, all these folks, 435 House members, 100 senators, they put their name on the line. They campaign, in some cases, for 2 years or more. They raise and spend a ton of money. They endure nasty attacks from their opponents. They endure nasty attacks from the news media. And finally, they get to Congress. They don't want to spend the rest of their life doing nothing. That wasn't why they ran. They ran because whether they're liberal or conservative, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they had real hopes of achieving something. And I think as we've watched the gridlock and the nastiness and government shutdowns and all the different examples of dysfunction, I think gradually a lot of the members in both parties and in both the House and the Senate are growing tired of not getting something done. I just see sort of glimmerings. You see various members on a bipartisan basis talking about issues, talking about new legislation, developing some ability to get in a room and listen to each other. You see some of it happening in trying to solve the current dilemma in the Senate, where there are now apparently real conversations underway between Democrats and Republicans on what to do about getting TSA paid and the Coast Guard paid and breaking out of this very long shutdown as it affected the Department of Homeland Security. You're seeing other ideas begin to emerge where people are looking around and saying, wait a second, everybody back home wants this done. Why can't we find some way to work together? So I wouldn't be at all surprised this summer to see a whole range of legislation come pouring through. Not all of it gigantic, not all of it historic, but building blocks, steps in the right direction, improvements. And I think that the mood in the Congress now is that voting yes rather than voting no would be really nice to do. Now, I've lived through this myself. After all, in the 20 years I was in Congress, we were in the minority for 16. During the period I was in the minority, we had 8 years of Reagan, 2 years of Jimmy Carter, 4 years of George H.W. Bush, and then 2 years of Bill Clinton. So we had both Democrats and Republicans. And we had to try to find some way to work together, to be in a position to get something done. And we passed a lot of things. The Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, was a bipartisan effort that came from people in both parties who felt that you had to do something to make life better for people with disabilities. So I do think that it's possible that you go through periods where people just really do have a deep sense of instead of finding things to disagree, what if we got up in the morning to find things that we can agree on? We used to teach our members to learn how to say yes if rather than no because, just to get them in a rhythm of being positive. So if somebody had an idea, your job was to say, yes, we could do that if, rather than say, no, we can't do that because. The difference psychologically was amazing. I think the other thing that's happened, a lot of members have now been there long enough that they're sort of talking to each other again. You know, we went through a period when I was there when members routinely would talk together. They'd routinely go on congressional delegations where you'd put half Republican, half Democrat. They'd fly around together. They'd talk to each other. They'd get to know each other. When I was speaker, we did events at Hershey Park. We did events at the National Zoo, just trying to get families together, to talk to each other, to learn something. Long before I was there, when Bob Michel was the Republican leader from Illinois and Danny Rostenkowski was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, they would drive back and forth. Bob lived down in Peoria and Danny was in Chicago. So they'd have a common meeting point on the Indiana border where they would leave one of their cars and they would then drive from that point all the way to Washington. Well, over the years, they really knew each other. In addition, they were big golfers. So they go out on the golf course together and just be more relaxed. be able to chat, to find a way to get something done. Now, my sense is we're beginning a little bit to drift back towards that. That doesn't mean it's true of everybody. You're going to have some conservatives who are going to want to hide in their corner and throw bombs. You're going to have some liberals and radicals who are going to want to hide in their corner and throw bombs. But in the middle, you may have as many as 350 members, Democrat and Republican, who would like to work together and would like to find a way to get something positive done. That's my optimistic view about where we are. Coming up, we're going to talk about the Stop Insider Trading Act proposed by Congressman Bryan Steil, chairman of the Committee on House Administration. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Congressman Bryan Steil. He has represented Wisconsin's 1st congressional district since 2019. And since 2023, he has served as the chairman of the Committee on House Administration. In January, Chairman Steil introduced the Stop Insider Trading Act, which will prohibit members of Congress, their spouses, and dependent children from purchasing publicly traded stock. Congressman Steil, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Speaker Gingrich, thanks for having me.
When you look at the polling, 86% of Americans say members of Congress should not be trading individual stocks. That's Democrats, Republicans, independents, all agreeing on something. That almost never happens. What do you think is behind this level of frustration?
I think it's popular because it's such common sense that members of Congress should not be day trading individual shares of stock, even to prevent the appearance of an impropriety. And so we all know members of Congress that come to Washington have some level of inside information. Insider trading is already illegal, but difficult to prove. And so my solution is let's just stop members of Congress from trading stock in the first place. Let's build the process of regaining the American trust. And I think a lot of Americans are suspicious for a whole host of reasons. And the easy answer here is let's just wholesale stop members of Congress from being able to trade individual shares of stock.
You're clearly on the American people's side. There was a 2023 survey by the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, which said that 86% of Americans support banning members of Congress from trading individual stocks. That included 88% of Democrats, 87% of Republicans, and 81% of independents. Now, you'd think when you had that size consensus, it ought to be pretty easy.
Yeah, things that should be easy in Washington are often things that are not easy in Washington. Although with this, I think we're really building the momentum that's ultimately going to be needed. President Trump called this out in his State of the Union by name, saying we need to pass this specific piece of legislation. We have growing bipartisan support in the House, and we have a commitment from the leadership that they're going to bring it to the floor of the House. And part of this legislation is to make sure that we're balancing two things. One, regaining the trust of the American people, but two, also making sure that individuals that come from successful business backgrounds are still able to come and serve in Congress. We're benefited by having an array of people that come and serve with us in Washington, from folks that are farmers, military background, or private sector backgrounds. It is my hope that we continue to build support for this legislation. We're seeing growing support in the United States Senate. Senator Pete Ricketts introduced this recently, and a growing number of senators are joining in this effort. I think there's a huge opportunity here to make one of the most transformative changes in the House as it relates to taking a real step forward on the integrity of the institution. And the American people, as you noted in some of the polling, are unquestionably suspicious as to what's going on. And the easy answer is just to ban it outright.
Is the Ricketts bill also called Stop Inside Trading?
Yes, there's the full companion bill to this legislation that we started in the House a handful of weeks ago. He's been a great partner in the Senate, and I think we have a real opportunity to get this across the line. And that momentum really picked up when President Trump, in his State of the Union, said he wants the Stop Insider Trading Act on his desk so he can sign it into law.
Although I spent 20 years in Congress, I was really surprised to read that almost 1 out of every 5 lawmakers trade stocks connected to the committee they serve on. That has got to be such a insult to the average American, that even if it's technically legal, the idea that you're serving on a committee, getting briefed, by definition, you have a unique level of knowledge. You're trading the stock that relates directly to your committee. I mean, it strikes me that what you're doing in this sense is looking right at a major weakness in how the Congress currently operates.
In 2012, Congress passed the Stock Act, and that legislation was a step forward and brought additional transparency as to the types of investments that members of Congress own. But what it didn't do was actually prevent members of Congress from being able to trade those individual stocks. So the transparency that was passed in 2012 was obviously a step forward, but left a glaring gap. And this legislation, the Stop Insider Trading Act, closes that gap and does so in a way that I think will truly regain the trust of the American people. And I think people are frustrated that members of Congress serve on committees or making decisions, and they're questioning whether or not those decisions are being made in the best interest of the American people or in the best interest of an individual member from a financial perspective. And so let's clean the whole thing up. Let's tell the American people that members of Congress aren't trading stocks in their own personal interest. If an individual wants to trade stocks, there's a place for that. It's called Wall Street. If you want to come to Washington, that's where you come to serve the American people. And our bill truly bifurcates those two things so that we prevent the suspicion that the American people have as to what's going up in Washington. I think a lot of people are frustrated with how Washington works. I'm frustrated with how Washington works. And this is our real opportunity to start cleaning up this mess.
Well, I noticed that the reform law they passed in 2012, known as the Stock Act, at one level it's almost silly. It provides for a $200 fine. If you're a serious investor and you just made some kind of deal off of insider knowledge, a $200 fine is irrelevant.
Well, you're exactly right. And the irony of that is it's uniquely irrelevant for large trades. So if an individual is trading $50 of stock and there was a $200 penalty, now that's reasonably significant. But of course, if an individual trades $50 million of stock, a $200 penalty is functionally irrelevant. And so what we did in our legislation is we looked at that and said, how do we balance this back out? We put forward a fine of $2,000 or 10% of the covered transaction and taking away all the profits associated with any sale. And so this comes in with some real and substantive teeth. So even if an individual was to trade, $50 or $50 million, the penalty associated with that is significant. It rips away all the profits, 10% of the value or $2,000, whichever is greater. It puts in place real teeth so that people are paying attention. Because as we all know, you got to not only enforce the law, the penalties have to be real, and making sure that people abide by this legislation is going to be absolutely essential.
When we come back, we're going to discuss how the Stop Insider Trading Act actually works, and also what the listeners can do to help get it passed. Now, you recently proposed the Stop Insider Trading Act. Exactly how would the Stop Insider Trading Act affect members of Congress and their families?
The Stop Insider Trading Act has kind of three key components. So one, members of Congress upon arrival can no longer buy individual shares of stock, period, full stop. The acquisition is completely stopped. Then we said, what do we do with people that had private sector careers before they came in? Maybe that's how they saved for a child's education. What do we do with those folks? And we said, okay, you can hold that stock, but to prevent you from being able to profit off of any insider information, if you're going to go sell that stock, you need to provide a minimum of 7 days advanced public notice of the sale. What does that do? That guts out any opportunity to profit off of any insider information, because effectively you're going to the American people in a public way. This will be posted on the clerk's website and saying, look, here is a stock that I'm selling. Here's the personal reason. My son or daughter's going to college or they're getting married. I'm going to make this sale. And the American people now know in advance of you, so they could trade in front of you and prevent you from being able to profit off of any insider information. And then the final piece is that we put real and substantive teeth. Again, that's that $2,000 fine or the 10% of the covered transaction in whichever is greater. So the old bill, as we were discussing, right, it doesn't have teeth if you're making big sales, which of course is ironic because that's exactly where you want the biggest teeth to be. You don't want people making multi-million-dollar sales. You don't want them doing it at all. But in particular, you don't want people doing multi-million-dollar sales. And that's where putting the teeth as a percentage of the transaction, as well as ripping away the profits, is really important. So in summary, right, it bans members from being able to acquire stock, gives you an avenue if you already had it on how you would get out, but requires advanced public notice, and then puts real and substantive teeth with the bill. And at the end, it functionally prevents members of Congress from being able to profit off of any insider information, and it's a huge step forward.
I mean, this is a very well thought out bill. I'm curious, when Trump endorsed it and encouraged Congress to pass the Stop Insider Trading Act, were you surprised or did you know that was coming?
We had a good suspicion that it was coming. In the process of drafting this legislation, gaining support in the House, moving it through committee, we had been in close contact with the administration. But, you know, in a State of the Union speech, and in particular with President Trump, you never know exactly what he's going to say, which is what makes the speech a little bit interesting. I had my suspicions that he would call out the topic, but when he called out the bill by name, that's where, you know, I got really excited and said, this is really an opportunity for us to truly get this done at a period of time when Congress is so narrowly divided. Very little legislation that's consequential is able to get across the line, and one in particular that every member of Congress has an opinion on, right? It's their own rules and regulations that govern the body. And so having President Trump step up behind this bill is a huge step forward, and I think gives us this opportunity to continue building momentum in the House. And we're seeing that momentum also now really begin to grow in the United States Senate.
Given all that, and I think you've done amazingly good, solid work, why is it not yet scheduled?
You know, that's a question that we continue to work with leadership on. Getting bills scheduled and on the floor is a real art in a period of time where the majority of the House of Representatives is functionally one vote. And so we are balancing the schedule, the current DHS shutdown. If you talk to folks going to the airports, they're struggling to get through TSA. That's been the priority in the short term. But I do think here in the coming weeks, I hope to see the leader and the speaker bring this to the floor to a vote. And I think it'll pass overwhelmingly. I think once you put an up or down vote in front of people that the American people can see, I think members of Congress are going to recognize that not only is this the right thing to do, but also that the American people are going to be demanding it of them. And I think you'll see this pass in overwhelming numbers and then hopefully get across the Senate line as well.
Sometimes there are issues that come up that are survival issues. If you vote wrong, you don't survive. This may well be one of them. Do you have any Democrat co-sponsors yet?
We have a couple Democrats who've come on board with this bill. Representative Riley is on board, as well as others. We've been in lots of discussions and conversations with our Democratic colleagues as well. I think there's a real need to get this done. Now, as you know, I mean, you served as Speaker. There's a push always from the minority party to find an excuse to vote no. And so, you know, you can make any argument you want, and it's often what I call the Goldilocks argument, which is, you know, oh, it's not quite good enough, or oh, it does a little too much. It's not quite perfect. And what we're trying to say is this is a meaningful and major step forward in the legislation. Some people think, you know, our penalties are a little too strong. Some people think our penalties, for example, are a little too weak. But you got to, at some point, draw the line. And I think when we did this with an eye to not only make sure that the bill works, that the bill has teeth, but that we can also build the support needed to get this done. Often people have come forward with different proposals as it relates to this topic, but they've watched it flounder either before it got to committee, before it got the support. This is really building up momentum. The president is behind it. The American people support it, which gives me the optimism that when we bring it to the floor, we will see more and more Democrats publicly endorse this legislation.
Coming up, we're going to discuss how the Save America Act is a meaningful step towards election integrity and the Withhold members' pay during Shutdown Act which will prevent members of Congress from getting paid during government break. You led the efforts to pass the Save America Act, and it's now still in the Senate, but the House got it there. Why do you think this is an important step towards election integrity?
We have a huge opportunity to strengthen Americans' confidence in our elections. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. And I have a piece of legislation called the MEGA Act. It's a comprehensive array of topics that need to be fixed. Two of those topics, making sure that only U.S. citizens are voting and that individuals are showing voter identification when they go to vote, is essential, common sense, simple, and straightforward. We package that as the Save America Act, and the American people get it. They know that throughout their daily lives, they have to show photo identification to do a whole host of common activities that occur on a daily basis. You want to board an airplane, you want to open a bank account, you need to have a photo identification. You should need a photo ID when you go and vote. And the second piece is, in particular, after 4 horrific years of the Biden administration allowing open border policies, the American people recognize that to register to vote, an individual should show that they're a United States citizen. And so we put this, working with my colleague and friend Chip Roy, into legislation. We moved it through my committee on the Committee on House Administration. And ultimately, I think that the American people support this overwhelmingly. And what we see is it passing the House of Representatives. But at its core is that common sense election integrity that will build Americans' confidence in how our elections operate. And as we saw in your home state of Georgia, when you pass election integrity legislation, people's confidence in our elections improve. And the experience in Georgia taught us a lot of lessons. It taught us that although the left is going to demagogue this issue, that what we ultimately can do is overcome that, put this law in place, and the law itself, as American people actually live under it, will be overwhelmingly popular, and people will have good experiences with their elections, and trust in our elections will increase. And what we continue to see is participation increasing as Americans' confidence in our elections increases, and that's a good thing for our democracy.
I agree with everything you've said, but it's been fascinating to me that when you have an overwhelming support, I think Pew Research poll in August said 83% of Americans favor requiring voters to show government-issued photo ID. And of course, we all do if you drive a car, you do it for a whole range of things. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, has been just vehemently aggressive in opposing this. Why do you think the Democrats are so strongly opposed?
Well, I think there's two things at play. One, I think the Democrats want weak election integrity laws to be on the books. I think they've shown that time and time again that they are scared of having strong election integrity legislation. I think that follows the broken border of the Biden administration. The other piece is we continue to see what I view as Trump derangement syndrome, meaning if President Trump said the sun is going to rise in the east, you will have a group of Democrats, and the more radicalized they are, the more likely they are to do this, who will go out and declare that there's no way the sun will rise in the east. It's coming from some other direction. The president would be false. And what we ultimately see is the president, in particular President Trump, his real strength is always coming back to common sense. And that's why the American people support him and understand the legislation that we're moving forward. In the end, then, the Democrats will argue against common sense. And that's, I think, in part what we're seeing in this legislation. It's common sense to require photo identification. It's common sense that only Americans should vote in elections. But the more radicalized Democrats will fight anything that President Trump is working on, regardless of how obvious and common sense the legislation is. And in a sense, they've boxed themselves into a corner on this. So it's a combination of Democrats not wanting election integrity legislation on the books at a period of time when we've had mass illegal immigration into the United States, combined with Trump derangement syndrome. And I think that's why the American people look at the Democratic Party and can't relate to them. And the polling shows that the brand Democrat is absolutely in the garbage. And it is because the Democrats will push back against any form of common sense legislation, from this Save America Act back to the Stop Insider Trading Act. And so the more we're showing that to the American people, the better we are. And the importance of putting this on the floor of the House, having it pass, and ultimately, hopefully getting it across the line to the Senate will just absolutely prove how ridiculous the Democrats' position is in this regard.
What you're doing, I think, is important, but you're also doing something else, which is really meddling, and which I think the average American thinks is exactly right, and that is, working with Senator John Kennedy, you introduced the Withhold members' pay during Shutdown Act. Walk us through that.
Well, I think the entire spending process in Washington is absolutely broken. I think that's proven itself since the original legislation of which we operate was passed in 1974. Then you get into the process of saying, how do we fix this? And one thing to me stands out, that members of Congress under the Constitution are being paid even if there is a government shutdown. So while countless American workers are required to show up to work without pay during a shutdown, members of Congress, unless they withhold their pay, continue to receive their income. My legislation, withholding members' pay in conjunction with Senator Kennedy's, says, look, members of Congress should not receive pay if the members of the federal government are required to show up for work and not receive their pay. So a perfect example of this is TSA agents, I think, as we all know, across the country, for weeks haven't received the pay that they're owed for showing up to work. They're required to show up for work. And so we have a situation where members of Congress aren't getting paid. TSA agents are. And if my legislation passed, and we moved it through the Committee on House Administration, is ready for floor action. The Senate is moving through Senator Kennedy's legislation on this. If we pass this into law, I think you would be shocked, or maybe not shocked, as to how fast members of Congress would say, all right, let's get everybody in the room. Let's sit down. Let's negotiate this. Let's get a deal and let's move forward. And the American people are sick and tired of watching Congress fail to operate in any efficient or effective manner. And I think this is a really important step in a way to align members of Congress with every other federal employee, but also to force members of Congress to actually show up, do their job, and get the legislation to fund the Department of Homeland Security across the line or in any other future potential shutdown.
I do think people have this sense of profound unfairness that everyday folks, people who just got up in the morning and want to go do their job, they're not getting paid. But the people whose failure to pass the legislation are getting paid. There is, I think, in that sense, in recent years, as we've gotten into more and more of these shutdown environments, a growing sense that somehow Congress has to feel the pain as well as the others. I have to say, Bryan, you come from a state, Wisconsin, which had a very deep reform tradition going back to La Follette at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And it seems to me that the bills you're doing are very much a kind of a Wisconsin good government approach. They're not Republican. They're not conservative in an ideological sense. They're just sound, decent approaches to trying to get to a more responsible, a more honest, and a more accountable government. I'm just curious, to what extent do you see yourself in that way, sort of carrying on a Wisconsin tradition?
I think there is a Wisconsin tradition of making sure that government is transparent, it's clean, and it's operating on behalf of the people it was structured to serve. And I think there is a broad frustration across the country with how Washington is operating, that Washington is there to serve its own special interests rather than to serve the American people. And I left a private sector career to come and serve the American people. And there's time and again where you look at the structure and the system in Washington and you think there's an absolute need for massive improvement. And there is a tradition from my home state of Wisconsin in this regard. I gained the chairmanship in the Committee of House Administration, which sets up legislation in this avenue. It gives me the opportunity to come in on election integrity where we have jurisdiction, on withholding member pay, on preventing members from trading stock, and coming in and putting real teeth into the institution. Sometimes that doesn't make me the most popular person in Washington, D.C., and I'm just fine with that. I'm more excited to have friends in Wisconsin than in Washington. And so this is a town that needs to be cleaned up. There's real substantive problems with how Washington operates. And bringing a Wisconsin common sense perspective is something that I'm proud to do.
You know, in a lot of ways, you remind me of Ron Johnson, who is frustrated at times in the Senate, but has that same Wisconsin focus on good government and desire to actually get something done. The two of you, I suspect, when you have lunch or breakfast, must have a lot of common thoughts about what needs to be fixed in Washington.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And the irony is both of us came from a manufacturing background, him a little bit later in his career than I when we left to come and serve in Washington. But I think there's just a pragmatic, common sense understanding of how you get things done if you've ever worked in the broader manufacturing sector. You can't sit and have philosophical fights in a factory if you're not producing a product on time of high quality. And if we look at Washington and we look at a lot of legislation, in particular, how we spend money, I think almost no one from any ideological perspective would say, man, this is a well-oiled machine that's working well, that's serving the American people. And the manufacturing mindset says, go back and look at the system and the process that you're engaged in, and is that part of the problem? And I would say absolutely yes. And some of these reforms go back at that core process. How do we fix the incentive structure to get a better product in the end? It's kind of in the weeds, but it's also, I think, really important that we do it, that we reform this system so that the ultimate legislation that's being passed, in particular on the spending side or other critical pieces of legislation, are far better than what we're getting out of Washington right now.
I think the average politician would be shocked to learn how deep and how bipartisan the support is for profound reforms. Bryan, I want to encourage you to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep thinking up more reforms. Hopefully we'll be able to join you again sometime and learn about the next wave of bills after this. And I want to encourage everybody to contact their senator and their House member and encourage them to bring up and vote on these bills. They're very important, and they're big building blocks towards a more accountable and a more respectable Congress. So I want to thank you both for your leadership and for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Speaker Gingrich.
And now, I'm pleased to introduce a new segment to Newt's World where I answer listeners' questions. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Logan from Binghamton, New York, home of the Speedy Sandwich, asks, China has been conducting more aggressive movements near Taiwan. Is the United States prepared if China strikes while the operation in Iran is ongoing? Well, Logan, I think it'd be fair to say that we would be stretched very thin, but that we would still have enormous capability, and that with the new Japanese Prime Minister having moved very aggressively to shift the Japanese defense system towards containing China, that it would be a very high risk for the Chinese communists to try to invade Taiwan. And as you may know, the Director of National Intelligence said publicly the other day, we have no indications of China trying to move aggressively against Taiwan in 2026 or 2027. So my guess is, for the moment, we can afford to focus on Iran and then see what happens. Adrian from Amarillo, Texas asks, Mr. Speaker, I would like your thoughts regarding the significance of President Trump's foreign policy decisions and how his decisions in Iran compare to previous presidents. Additionally, how will this perception of his foreign policy decision affect the midterm elections? What do you believe the correct messaging strategy is? Adrian, those are two very good questions. First of all, I think the president broke with what had been decades of American presidents who would negotiate with the Iranians, get nothing done, declare victory, and allow the Iranians to grow stronger, to develop nuclear weapons, to develop missiles. And Trump decided that he'd had enough of that, that in fact, in the long run, that was a road to disaster. And so he began taking very serious steps, starting with the bombing of the nuclear facilities a year ago, and now with this ongoing campaign that we're in the middle of now. It took a lot of courage. It's not clear yet whether or not it's going to work. The Iranians have been preparing for this for almost a half century. They're going to do everything they can to push us back. But The president so far has indicated a real willingness to use American power to collaborate with the Israelis and now with a number of other countries, so that there's actually a coalition being built that would take the Strait of Hormuz and protect it, that would reopen everything for oil worldwide, and that would isolate Iran and ultimately lead to the collapse of the dictatorship. We'll see how it works out. I think that the message for the campaign has to be pretty simple. We're in a dangerous world. We're facing a dangerous enemy. We have a president with the courage to do the right thing, and Americans should support the president when America is taking on an enemy who literally chants death to America on a regular basis and who has described America as the great Satan and who's very clear that they, in fact, want to destroy us. So defeating the religious dictatorship, allowing the Iranian people to, in fact, organize their own government and become part of a normal country, if the president can pull this off, he will truly be a historic figure of the First Order. It's a big gamble, but he's working at it. And so far, at least, you have to give him credit that he's done more to change Iran than any president since 1979 when the dictatorship took over. I look forward to hearing from you. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Thank you to my guest, Congressman Bryan Steil. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.